Why living with a small self can set you free. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the urge to prove yourself? Have you ever lost sleep replaying someone's comment, long after they forgot they said it? Or maybe you've clung to your achievements, your titles, your opinions, because without them, you're not sure who you are anymore. If so, you're not alone, you're simply living inside the most invisible, and yet most powerful, prison of all, the prison of the ego. In today's world, we are taught to stand out, to rise above, to brand ourselves, but the more we build this identity, the more we find ourselves trapped in it. We carry it everywhere like heavy armor, always defending, always comparing, always needing to be seen, heard, and validated. And this, according to Buddhist wisdom, is why we suffer. Let me tell you a story. David was a high-level executive in a fast-growing tech firm, smart, driven, respected, but also, secretly, exhausted. Every meeting was a battlefield, every email felt like a personal attack if someone disagreed, and every success only gave him a moment of relief, until the next threat to his image showed up. He wasn't leading a team, he was managing a fragile idea of himself. That's what the ego does. It builds a throne inside your mind and convinces you to serve it endlessly. In Buddhist philosophy, this ego is known as atta, the illusion of a fixed, separate self, but the Buddha taught the principle of anatta, non-self, a radical understanding that we are not our roles, our stories, or even our thoughts. Everything we call me is just a stream of conditions, constantly changing, and yet we cling to them as if they were permanent. We say, I am this, I am that. And then we suffer when life dares to move on without our permission. Think about it. When was the last time you felt hurt? Not physically, but emotionally. Was it because your body was in danger, or was it because your image was? Most of our pain comes not from what happens, but from what happens to our ego. Someone ignores us, we feel invisible. Someone criticizes us, we feel attacked. Someone succeeds, we feel threatened. It's not life that wounds us, it's the ego's interpretation of life. So here's the paradox: the ego promises to protect us, but in reality, it becomes the very source of our fear, jealousy, and disconnection. What if there was a way out? What if shrinking the ego doesn't mean losing yourself, but actually finding a self that's freer, lighter, and more connected than you ever imagined? In the next chapter, we'll explore what the ego really is, not just the surface-level arrogance we often think of, but the deeper, subtler illusion we've been feeding all our lives. And maybe, just maybe, we'll discover the doorway to peace was never outside us, it was just on the other side of letting go. We pulled back the curtain and caught a glimpse of the ego, not as our enemy, but as a frightened child pretending to be king. But what is this ego, really? Why do we keep feeding it, day after day, even when it exhausts us? To understand this, we have to look deeper, beyond self-help slogans, beyond the idea of just letting go. Because the ego isn't just an attitude, it's an architecture, built carefully over time, with every thought, every label, and every fear. Think back to when you were a child. Do you remember when someone first called you smart, shy, stubborn, or good at math? Those weren't just descriptions, they became foundations. We began to believe them. We started building a self from words others handed to us. By the time we were teenagers, that self had rules: this is who I am, this is who I'm not. And just like that, the ego was born, not as something evil, but as a survival tool, a strategy, a mask we wore to feel safe in a chaotic world. In Buddhist psychology, this construction of ego is seen as a product of clinging to form, to feelings, to perception, to thoughts, to consciousness. These are the 5 aggregates, skandhas, the building blocks of what we think we are. But the Buddha said, these are not self. They arise, and they pass away. So why do we cling to them? Because we crave stability in an unstable world. The ego gives us the illusion of control, the illusion of identity. It tells us, if I can define myself, then I won't be lost. But ironically, it is this very definition that keeps us from ever being truly found. Imagine the ego as a shadow puppet show on a wall, Every movement, every reaction, every opinion, it dances across the screen. But what we forget is that the puppet is hollow. It only moves because someone, is holding it up from behind. We confuse the puppet for the real thing. We forget the hand behind the shadow. That hand is awareness. That's the part of us untouched by praise or blame. It sees without clinging. It watches without judgment. It is, without needing to be anything. Let me ask you something. Have you ever surprised yourself? Maybe you acted braver than you thought you could. Or maybe you laughed in a moment you thought you'd cry. Who was that? That wasn't the ego. That was you, unfiltered, unboxed, unburdened. And that's the secret the ego doesn't want you to discover, that you are already whole without it. So if the ego is just a story, then who are you? Without your story, who are you when you're not trying to impress, protect, or perform? In the next chapter, we'll dive into what happens when the ego takes the driver's seat, how it subtly hijacks your relationships, your ambitions, even your spirituality. We'll explore the signs of an overfed ego, and why recognizing them is the first step toward real harmony. Because the truth is, the ego isn't just what we are. It's what we think we must be to be loved. And that belief is what keeps us running in circles. We ended the last chapter with a haunting question: who are we? Without the story the ego tells, but what happens when that story becomes the only one we know? What happens when ego isn't just a background narrator, but the loudest voice in the room? That's when things get subtle and dangerous, because ego doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and when we don't notice, it begins to take over, guiding our choices, poisoning our peace, distorting our truth. Meet Sarah. On the surface, she was calm, compassionate, even spiritual. She meditated every morning, drank green smoothies, and posted quotes from Thich Nhat Hanh on Instagram. But behind closed doors, she was constantly judging, comparing, needing to be the most conscious person in the room. She didn't realize it, but her ego had just changed clothes. It no longer needed praise for beauty or success. It now fed on spiritual superiority. The form changed, the hunger didn't. This is one of the Buddha's most profound teachings. The fetters of the mind are subtle. They arise even in robes of purity. The ego isn't always proud. Sometimes it plays the victim. Sometimes it hides behind humility. Sometimes it becomes our idea of being enlightened. And that's when it's most dangerous, when we don't even see it. So how do we know when ego is taking over? Here are the quiet signs. When we argue just to be right, not to understand. When we feel threatened by someone else's success. When we're obsessed with being seen a certain way, whether as powerful, wise, or even kind. When we hold grudges not because we're hurt, but because we can't stand being wrong. When we perform kindness, hoping for applause. These aren't just personality quirks, they're echoes of the ego's need to survive. In modern psychology, this is known as the false self. It's the mask we wear to get love, approval, protection, but like all masks, it suffocates us the longer we wear it. Buddhism goes even further. It says, there is no true self to defend at all, only an ever-changing stream of thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Trying to fix or polish the ego is like trying to straighten the waves of the ocean. The real liberation comes, not from making the ego perfect, but from seeing that it was never who you were to begin with. So let me ask you, how much of your energy goes into protecting your image? How often do you hold back your truth to be liked, or force your opinions to feel important? These aren't small questions, they shape our entire lives. Because here's the hard truth, the ego doesn't want peace, it wants control, and peace only comes when we no longer need to win. But don't worry, this isn't a message of despair, it's a message of awakening. Because the moment you see the ego clearly, is the moment you stop being ruled by it. In the next chapter, we'll explore exactly how to begin that process, not by waging war against the ego, but by developing something far more powerful: awareness, compassion, and the courage to let go of needing to be somebody. Because the less we hold on to ourselves, the more space there is for truth, for love, for life itself to flow in. We've seen how the ego hides, in anger, in comparison, even in our desire to be spiritual. But what now? Do we crush the ego, fight it, deny it? No, the Buddha never taught war. He taught seeing, he taught softening, he taught humility, not as weakness, but as power without pride. Let me tell you a story. Once, a young monk came to his master, burning with questions. He said, "Master, I've memorized sutras. I've fasted. I've meditated for hours. Why do I still feel restless? Why do I still suffer?" The old monk smiled gently and said, "Because your bowl is too full." The young monk looked confused. "Full of what?" "Of yourself," the master said, "until you empty it. Nothing new can enter." That's the essence of humility. It's not thinking less of yourself, it's simply thinking of yourself less, it's stepping back. So space can open, it's releasing the need to be special, to be right, to be first, so you can finally hear. Really hear, the truth in others, and the truth in you. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha said, "As rain does not fall on a house with a well-thatched roof, so passion does not enter a mind that is well-trained." When ego dominates, the roof leaks, every praise inflates us. Every insult crushes us, we're constantly reacting, never resting. But with humility, we become like the ocean, deep, calm, unaffected by the wind on the surface. Ask yourself, do I always need to prove I'm right? Do I feel uneasy when someone else shines? Do I interrupt just to be heard? Do I find it hard to say, "I don't know," or "you were right"? These are not faults. They are signs, signs that the ego is too loud, and the heart too silent. Humility is not something we achieve, it's what remains. When ego dissolves, modern mindfulness teacher Tara Brach calls it the trance of unworthiness, where we're constantly measuring ourselves against others, running, chasing approval, status, security. But when we practice humility, we step out of that trance. We breathe, we soften, we remember, I am already enough, not because of what I achieve, but because I am. Think of the ego as a clenched fist, it's tight, defensive, trying to hold on to everything. Humility is the open hand, it receives, it releases, it's not empty because it's poor, it's empty because it's ready. And so, the ego begins to shrink, not by force, but by awareness, by kindness, by truth. But here's the question, can we live in the world, with ambition, with relationships, with opinions, and still keep the ego quiet? Can we move through life without being consumed by the self? We've begun to loosen the grip of the ego, to recognize the power of humility, to let go of the need to control. Now comes the next invitation, to stop resisting, not to surrender in defeat, but to awaken into deep harmony, with life, with others, with the present moment. There's a Zen story of a man caught in a river's current. He's tossed by the waves, panicking, trying to swim against the flow. He's exhausted, drowning, terrified. Then, he lets go, he surrenders to the current, and to his surprise, it carries him safely to shore. This is how most of us live, swimming upstream, fighting what is. We resist discomfort, we resist uncertainty, we resist change, pain, people, even ourselves. But what if peace begins the moment we stop saying, "This shouldn't be happening"? The Buddha didn't promise us a world without suffering, he simply showed us that our reaction to suffering is optional. Pain is real, but our resistance to pain, that's where the deeper suffering begins. When we stop resisting, we stop clinging, and when we stop clinging, we begin to flow. Think about how we resist every day, the traffic jam we hate, the colleague who annoys us, the unexpected change in plans, the failure we didn't want, the emotion we try to push away. But resistance is like trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands. It only makes the waves stronger. What if instead, we learn to surf? To accept is not to agree. To accept is not to give up. To accept is to say, "This is what's happening right now. Can I meet it with wisdom?" It's an inner posture of openness, like soft earth absorbing the rain, not judging the storm, but receiving it. Look at bamboo. It bends in the storm, it doesn't fight the wind, and because it yields, it never breaks. This is the strength of true harmony. It's not brittle, it's flexible, it doesn't need to win. Living in harmony also means letting go of being right, especially in relationships. How many arguments start because we resist listening, because we react instead of receive? Harmony is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of deep understanding, to say, I hear you. I may not agree, but I see your truth too. This is compassion in action. The next time you feel tension rising, pause, ask gently, what am I resisting in this moment? What part of me wants this to be different? Then breathe, loosen your grip, and choose presence. Over control, that's the turning point, from reaction to wisdom, from chaos to peace. But let's be honest, living in harmony isn't easy in a world built on noise, speed, and ego. So how do we stay aligned with truth? When the world keeps pulling us outward, how do we protect our peace, without shutting ourselves off? So you've begun to loosen your grip, you've stopped pushing the river, and you're learning to live with the flow of life. But there's still one subtle voice that keeps pulling us out of peace, not the world outside, but the world within, a voice that never seems to stop talking, the mind. Have you ever sat in silence, only to be met by 1,000 thoughts, regrets from yesterday, worries about tomorrow, that conversation you should have handled better, that thing you have to do next? Even when the world grows quiet, the noise within continues. In Buddhism, we call this the monkey mind, always swinging from one branch of thought to another, rarely still, rarely here. And yet, deep inside each of us, beneath the thinking, beneath the noise, beneath the constant inner narration, there is something else, a stillness, a silence, a space that watches without reacting. Imagine the sky. Thoughts are like clouds, moving, shifting, sometimes stormy, but the sky itself, always spacious, always unaffected, your awareness is that sky, and meditation is the art of remembering that truth. There's a story of a young man who went to a Zen master, frustrated and restless. I want peace, he said, but my mind won't stop. I sit down to meditate, and I feel worse. The master smiled, and handed him a glass of muddy water. Let this sit, he said. Minutes passed. And slowly, the mud began to settle, the water cleared. See? The master whispered, you don't have to force stillness, you just have to stop stirring. Inner silence doesn't mean you stop thinking, it means you stop being hooked by every thought. You become the witness, not the actor caught in every drama. You learn to sit with yourself, without judgment, without needing to escape, and something beautiful begins to happen. The heart opens, the breath softens, and in the stillness, truth emerges. As Thich Nhat Hanh once said, silence is essential. We need silence just as much as we need air, just as much as plants need light. Without silence, we forget who we are. In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded, notifications, news, opinions, algorithms, endless scrolling. But here's a secret most people never realize: you can turn off your phone, you can turn down the world. But if you don't learn how to turn down your mind, you'll never find peace. Try this. Take a deep breath right now. Feel the air enter your body, and as you exhale, let go of trying to figure anything out, just listen to the silence between my words, to the stillness underneath the sound. This silence, it's always here. It's where clarity lives, it's where compassion lives, it's where you truly live. In silence, we reconnect with what matters, with the softness of a sunrise, with the kindness in someone's eyes, with the gentle truth that we don't have to chase life, we just have to be present for it, and presence is born from stillness. But what happens when you live from this space, when you walk into the world without needing to prove, to chase, to defend? What kind of freedom opens up when you live not from ego, but from essence? That's what we'll explore in our final chapter, the gift of the small self, a life of true connection. Because in letting go of the loud me, we discover something far more beautiful, the quiet joy of belonging to it all. So, we've been on a journey together, a journey of letting go, of realizing that the louder we try to be, the more we lose our way, of learning to live with a small self, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Now, we come to the heart of it all, the gift of the small self. Imagine a river, not the roaring, powerful river that carves mountains with its force, but a small, quiet stream, flowing gently, weaving through the earth, nourishing all it touches. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't try to be bigger than it is, but in its simplicity, it gives life to the whole valley. This is the gift of the small self, not seeking greatness, but embracing humility, and in that humility, finding true connection. There's an ancient story about a humble monk. He lived in a small hut at the edge of a village. Every day, he would go to the river to fetch water. The villagers would stop and ask him, "How do you find peace, day after day, in such simplicity?" And the monk would smile, gently saying, "When you let go of the need to be something, you become everything." This is the paradox we often miss. We think that to be important, we must stand out, we must be seen, we must be heard, but in reality, the true power is found in the quiet moments, the moments when we can just be, no masks. No ego, just you, as you are, present with the world, in the smallness of the self. We find immensity. In Buddhism, the idea of the small self is rooted in non-attachment, letting go of the need to cling to a fixed identity, not needing to be anyone other than who you already are. When we let go of the layers we've built around ourselves, we discover something far more profound, the true self that was always there. This self is not loud, it doesn't seek approval, it simply exists, in harmony with all things. Think of a tree. It doesn't try to be the tallest or most beautiful, it doesn't compare itself to the mountains or the clouds, it simply grows and offers shade to anyone who seeks it. It is content in its own way, connected to the earth, reaching toward the sky. This is what it means to live with a small self, to simply be. And yet, to be so deeply connected to all things. When we live from a place of humility, we stop trying to separate ourselves from others. We stop building walls, we stop competing. Instead, we connect, we listen, we offer what we can without expectation, and in doing so, we inspire others to do the same. Imagine a world where each of us embraced our smallness, not as a weakness, but as a source of strength. What kind of world would that be? The greatest gift you can give yourself, and the world, is to live authentically, without the weight of ego, and to embrace the small, beautiful life that is yours. When you let go of the need to control, to force, to be seen, you free yourself to simply be present, to find joy in the simple moments, to be content with what is. And in that contentment, you will find the peace you've been searching for. As we come to the end of our journey together, I invite you to pause, take a deep breath, and reflect on this. What would it feel like to live without the pressure of being more? What would it feel like to live with a small self, content, peaceful, connected? This is the life of true freedom, the life where we are at home with ourselves, and at home with the world. Thank you for walking this path with me. As you continue your own journey, may you find the peace and joy that comes with living from the heart of the small self. If this journey resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more insights and stories like this. Remember, true peace comes not in striving, but in simply being.